Hello, everyone, and welcome to CSUCI and Teaching and Learning Innovation's Resilient Teaching Interview Series, where we are talking with faculty about focused topics related to their experiences pivoting to emergency virtual instruction during the COVID-19 upheaval of our spring 2020 semester. I am Lorna Gonzalez, and I am the Interim Assistant Director of Innovation and Faculty Development, as well as teaching faculty in the School of Education. Behind the scenes, we have Ben Heitrek, TLI's media specialist. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Blake Gillespie, Program Chair and Professor of Chemistry at California State University, Channel Islands. Dr. Gillespie makes no secret of his belief that doing science, that is participating in scientific inquiry, troubleshooting, and research, prepares students for a life of inquiry, whether academic or otherwise. Dr. Gillespie was kind enough to allow us to publish and share on our Teaching and Learning Innovations blog a letter he had written to his faculty colleagues in which he asked them to rethink their testing and assessment practices, most especially during this pivot to virtual instruction. We are going to talk with him about what he said in that letter today, as well as respond to some reader questions that we've received since the post was published. Dr. Gillespie, thank you for being here and thank you for sharing your post and welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me and thanks for publishing it.
In your post, you suggest that if we are focusing our concern on whether or how to catch students cheating on exams, then we might be asking the wrong questions or spending our energy in the wrong places. So if you don't mind, I'd like to begin by reading an excerpt from your post and then talking with you about it. So you write, I know there is a great deal of consternation about cheating on tests, given how easy it has become to find answers to exam questions. Going forward from this term, I'd like you to check your assumptions about the value of multiple choice exams in student learning in this new context. So I'm going to repeat that last part again. I'd like you to check your assumptions about the value of multiple choice exams in student learning in this new context. And of course, by this new context, you're referring to the emergency pivot to virtual instruction. So if you could, would you talk to me about this post, which is a letter to your colleagues?
Yeah, well, so this is probably, I think this came during finals week. And during finals week, I was receiving and have been receiving over the course of the term, lots of emails from faculty detailing instances of academic dishonesty. And I kept hearing about these and trying to come up with solutions to help. But in the end, and this is of course happening after the fact when I'm posting this letter to them, it made me realize that what we really should be doing is thinking differently about how we're assessing students during the COVID pandemic when classes have all moved online. And cheating is always a big concern in STEM as well as any discipline. And oftentimes in chemistry, in certain classes, especially lower division classes, will offer an American Chemical Society exam, a multiple choice exam that's standardized as the assessment. And even there, people are very concerned about academic dishonesty. Do you have a cheat sheet? Are you looking at your neighbor's work? But there's pretty good policing that we can do of that, and people proctor their exams carefully and monitoring the class. But that's sort of gone out the window now as students are all online. And a lot of times things are asynchronous, and so it's even more challenging to monitor how students are doing. And my sort of thinking about that was that, well, instead of just trying to add more layers to the policing that we're doing of students' behavior, instead we should be thinking harder about what kind of questions we want to be asking students about their learning. And it's challenging, I think, because we're accustomed to doing things a particular way. Most chemistry faculty, most faculty are accustomed, especially in a larger class, of doing things a particular way, and they're not as ready to abandon that sort of past practice for something that's complicated and new and requires a steep learning curve to be ascended. So I was just trying to present that as an encouragement. Like, we don't have to just obsess about this thing. We can instead try to use this time, summertime now, to creatively assess how we should be doing that. And I just wanted to send that as a way to think positively about the future, instead of it's very depressing during finals week to worry about students' academic dishonesty here at the very end, when we'd rather be celebrating students and our own accomplishments. So I was trying to be positive and encouraging about doing something different than what we've already tried this term.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I have thoughts about, the fact that many faculty are accustomed to assessing students in a certain way, and also just that the examples that are out there that are sort of in higher ed consciousness around assessment, or what publishing companies are, offering for instructors, are, sort of fall into that multiple choice exam genre, and then the added sort of work it takes for faculty to reimagine their assessments, it seems like. But situating that in the questions that we have about student learning is a great way to start. So also in your post, you offer multiple choices from peer-reviewed journals in your discipline, chemistry, both as a counter argument to multiple choice exam practices, but also as a resource for enacting what you referred to as a departmental value of creative connection of meaningful assessment to learning object. I like the way you put that. So why was that important to you as you were writing this to your colleagues?
Well, I mean, the list of items that I tried to present for people, I thought it's not enough to just say, that ACS exam that you give year after year is garbage and we need to throw it out and start over. I wanted to present some sort of basis for that, and there's plenty of literature on that, and it's very deep and wide literature, but and I can't say that I've plumbed all the depths of that, but it's not hard to find some reasonably high quality philosophy as well as practical application. And so I was trying to find both of those and give people tools to start thinking about this. And I think now that I'm looking back at this, it does strike me as we enter the summer phase, which as you certainly know, and maybe other people that might be listening know, that now we have some time and resources to imagine more carefully how we're going to handle things in the fall. And I'm hoping that this particular aspect of what we do in the fall stays front and center. So in the absence of sort of specific training for faculty to engage in, they can at least start with these as examples of how they could reimagine their own sort of assessment tools.
Yes, okay, that's great. Well, I hope they take that up. So when we published this post, we also invited readers to submit their questions. And so I'm going to share those questions with you and ask you to comment on them. So thank you for setting us up with some context and the purpose of the post that you had written. So Maria says, great blog, Blake. I have been thinking a lot about assessments and made drastic changes this spring, moving away from final exams, multiple choice questions, etc. However, I haven't been able to address a simple related question. How can I be sure that students are submitting their work, with their in all caps, versus hiring or asking someone to do it for them? At least I interact with them in a synchronous call in which they present and I can ask questions, but I can't be sure that the paper, video, website, etc. that they are submitting has truly been created by them. Don't get me wrong, I believe our students want to learn and I trust them, but we have all experienced some free riders that want to take shortcuts. Any insights or suggestions would be much appreciated there.
I really believe that I need to focus just less energy on worrying about students' academic dishonesty, not ignore it and not address it when it pops up or when I observe it, not even not stop looking for it, but stop obsessing about it in a way that prevents me from focusing my attention where on a place it really belongs. And I believe that where the attention really belongs is on the learning of the students that are engaged. So I think I don't know how to teach or explain to someone how you can just not worry so much about whether they're being honest or not. And maybe we'll come back to that question a little bit later, but I just think that you have to make room cognitively for yourself as an instructor to think about what's actually important to you, which is learning, not checking to see that these students are doing doing things the right way, or doing things according to whatever your contract for academic dishonesty was. I think you instead have to focus on the students that are engaging. But I also think too that there are ways that we can address the roots of cheating, and I think an important part of that is maybe just the way that we structure assignments. So I think that oftentimes when I've encountered academic dishonesty among my own students, it often has to do with just panic about what a deadline. When something has to be due, I'm behind. How do I get it done? I have to find this answer now. And so how do you sort of dismantle the structure that leads to this having to get the big thing done at the end? And so that's all about a scaffolding approach. And an example that I would use for my own class, if they're writing a research paper, it's not just a draft that they submit halfway through the term and then they have the final version later. There's a lot more structure that you can build into that helps them model good behaviors for research in any case. And so, but it also sort of attenuates the panic they're having about deadlines. It's not even a midterm panic. No, it's okay, in 2 weeks I have this 3 sentences I need to submit. That's a low stakes, right? That's the term I think that we hear in assessment all the time is low. And so again, this isn't, I'm not making this up. It's just low stakes assignments that lead you somewhere. And each of those assignments is connected to the next. And so as a whole, you're allowing them to think about how they're going to organize their time and energy, but you're not doing it in a way that means that all the outcomes of this class hinge on this one product. Nope, they're all related, and every aspect of this project is equally important, right? How I begin the project is just as important as how I end the project. And so I think if you think carefully about how you build that assignment, including the point value of each of those elements, that's a way that you can actually pull back on some of the students' panic about cheating. That's kind of one way that I think about that.
Yeah, so removing the conditions under which students feel compelled to cheat in the first place.
Yeah, and partly, so that's just for one sort of activity. But I think too, when you set up a structure in a class, and this happens frequently in STEM classes, I don't know why, but it does. So we might have 2 midterms. You might just have 1 midterm and a final, and then suddenly you've created this structure that's aimed straight at the panic of the students. So why create a situation where the students are going to be panicked? Instead, why not structure your assessment in a way that's less isolated and more distributed, and then more focused on what they might be actually learning too? So that's what are they getting out of a multiple choice test is sort of separate from why are you structuring the grading system around these big objects that are going to induce cheating.
Right. Yeah, and just as my own comment, I did say this in another conversation with someone about assessment, but what I'm hearing you describe is a practice that sounds a lot more humane than the practice of creating a high stress, high stakes testing environment.
Yeah, and on that note too, I would say, I kind of said, well, we should spend our energy on the students that are engaged, but I also think that, college is sort of the last chance for students to sort of learn about what's acceptable in the real world. And we have to acknowledge that and say, well, we're here to teach them. And one of the things that we're here to teach them is how to avoid these sort of situations. But I guess what I really wanted to say is that I'd like to find the mental space to figure out how to bring those students that are cheating sort of back into the engagement pool, not to just say, well, I'm not going to worry about that. Well, I'm not, going to worry as much about cheating, but I'm also going to try to make sure that, again, by the way that I structure my class, perhaps that I can bring people back. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to hold that thought because I do have a follow-up question on engagement, but I'm watching the time. I'm going to take us to the next reader question. This one's actually a comment. So if you want to comment on it afterward, you're welcome to, or we can move on. IK says, loved your blog. Is there a chance, oh, excuse me, there is a chance that those of us who are not STEM inclined, putting it mildly, will at least learn something and use it. Bravo for thinking of your students first. Believe me, if they want to cheat because their life hangs on the grade of this class, which they have to take, they will cheat. And that does speak to what we were just talking about as well.
Yeah, right. So I saw that comment too, and I just think, there's no end to cheating. There's always going to be someone that feels the need to get around the structures that you put in place. So how we can break that cycle, I guess, is something I'm very interested in.
Yeah. And then Bill asks, as flawed as multiple choice is, it is efficient. As classes get larger, whether it's larger universities or public high schools, for example, balancing the desire for genuine assessment and individual feedback with the practicalities of scale and workload can be a challenging hurdle. What advice do you have for efficiently and effectively assessing a large number of students when you are just one person?
Yeah. Choose to work at an institution dedicated to smaller one-on-one interactions with faculty. No, that's obviously not something that we all have control over, but multiple choice tests are efficient, period, end of story. But that's just, I just can't find that to ever be a compelling reason to use them as the single arbiter of a student's success or measure of a student's learning. I think that the flaws are so substantial that there's just no way to justify them. Yeah, and they don't actually measure oftentimes what we'd really like to measure, which is, again, I would just refer people back to one of the why ask why. The article was why ask why that I was referencing in the blog post. It's a really wonderful article about even how you can create a multiple choice test that still gets a little better or closer to accessing what student learning you're really after. I think that you just have to accept that the multiple choice is not an appropriate way to approach student learning, at least not the sole way to approach student learning. And so once you've freed yourself from that, then you have to ask, what am I going to do next? And I don't have the answer to that. Everything is going to take time. And the fact is that grading smaller objects might take more time. There might be ways to structure your own grading so that makes that easier, actually. You're certainly not going to be spending a lot of time creating and maintaining the integrity of your perfect multiple choice exam from semester to semester, right? So there's a lot of mental energy put into just creating this kind of object instead of thinking about the other kinds of objects. But I think that I think that we have to commit ourselves to using what we know to work well in learning and assessment of learning. And I don't think that's going to be a satisfying answer, but I think once you decide that a multiple choice test efficiency isn't sufficient reason to use them, then you're going to have to say, well, you're going to have to look around and say, well, what does the discipline of education tell me the best practices are, and how am I going to start employing them? I just have to start now and think creatively about that.
And that thought actually ties nicely to the next question as well. Speaking of maybe the disconnect or the tension between the questions that we're asking, the questions that we're asking about student learning and the way by which we're asking them to demonstrate their learning. John says, the traditional lab report does not really assess a student's ability to perform a technique. It evaluates their ability to write about what happened, which is problematic for many reasons. I would be interested to know, what is the role of assessment in a lab class, and to what extent could assessment be rethought to evaluate student lab techniques just as much as their abilities to analyze data sets from prescriptive procedures?
Yeah, I mean, labs is one that we've been giving a lot of thought to, excuse me, mostly because we can't do it the normal way anymore, right? You can sort of port a lecture class to online reasonably easily, or without the same sort of failures that you're going to have when you try to do that with a lab class. And so um, uh, what I've been trying to do with my own team, the chemistry faculty in my department, is encourage us to think about what we even want students to get out of learning of a laboratory. What kind of learning objectives are there for that laboratory? And what we've discovered is that for a lot of the classes, there aren't specific learning objectives solely for the lab, which is just terrible. So we're trying to correct those problems. But even so, the objectives that are present for classes that do have them can be kind of weak. And so I think it's definitely worth it for a laboratory to stop and ask yourself, what are we really trying to do? What are we really trying to present them with in this environment? And I think there are different schools of thought on that. A lot of times when I talk to colleagues about it, they're talking about wanting them to be able to perform a specific technique. So that's sort of one direction that labs go. And so I expect you to have facility and familiarity with this kind of method. And that's important too for safety reasons. We want students to adopt habits that are easier to adopt if you are physically manipulating objects, and when there are actual consequences to not handling them the appropriate way. So that's one element. But that element is really difficult to frame learning objectives around that are based on Bloom's taxonomy, right? So it's very difficult to create a learning objective about synthesis of knowledge from that kind of technique-driven laboratory. A long-standing problem with laboratories is a failure to incorporate the scientific method into laboratories. And so that's the synthesis of theory into hypothesis and experimental design, and then interpretation of data, and then repeating it all, right? That's the process as the way we construe it now. But most labs are very prescribed, right? We have a set of steps. You need to follow the steps. And if you don't follow the steps, that's going to blow up in your face, or it's not going to change color the right way. And so we follow the steps to the end. This is zero to do with science, right? And so we ask ourselves, when we're deciding sort of which of those two poles of lab activity are most important to us, we just have to determine where our values lie. And I don't have a everyone has to answer that for themselves. And as I said, they both are important. So, but it is challenging it is a challenge to think about how you can construct a real a lab activity that approaches a problem from a scientific perspective and with scientific methods, and how to assess that then. So I guess I'm not giving an answer to that question specifically. I'm just saying that you have to decide what you're trying to assess. And I guess what I would say is, I think you mentioned something about lab reports. Why are you giving a lab report, and why are you giving 6? Yeah, and how do those lab reports touch base with what the objectives of the course actually are, or what you're, at least if you don't, in the absence of learning objectives, what you actually construe the importance of the lab to be. Writing is a part of the lab experience, but it's not a part of, but it's only one part. Yeah, and so how do we address all of those other parts? And assessing the importance of experiential learning is a discipline in and of itself, right? That I'm not going to tell you where to go to find that. It's easy to find that literature and think about how that applies to your own laboratories. But I would say the overarching goal is you decide what's important, and then you decide how you're going to assess that. And is it just going to be a lab? And why is it going to, if you're interested in the techniques, and why are you assessing a lab report? That doesn't make any sense to me. So just looking for those points of disconnect are actually really instructive as a teacher, because you find out what parts of your practice are automatic, and that can't be. That they have to all be intentional, right? So just that examination, and again, going back to why I asked my colleagues to think about this stuff in the first place, is everything that we do should be intentional. Accidents are always amazing, but if we're just doing things because that's the way we've already done them, that's not really an acceptable way to proceed, especially when they're continuously making us bump into sort of problems like cheating, or like labs. Now we're going to teach labs online or partially online, and what does that even mean? So it forces us to stop and evaluate what our goals are for a laboratory experience.
Right, we are forced into that spot. And listening to you speak, I have to say that I've got several other questions that I wish I could ask you. So I'm trying to think if maybe we could do some kind of follow-up, and I don't want to take too much of your time, and I am watching that too. So I think
sure, if there's interest, I'm happy to.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I think as just a last sort of quick question, I would like to come back to that piece about engagement, because that is sort of setting up the conditions, right, where students are learning and where they're, as part of their demonstration of learning, they're creating meaningful learning objects. And so another theme throughout your post really was engagement, even though that was an explicit term, and looking for ways to engage students during distance learning and as we look toward the fall, and really faculty spending their time focusing on that rather than how do I stop the cheating. And so I guess my question is, early in your post, you spoke to the disappointment you had about trying to engage your students with this amazing demonstration, in your backyard, and but then being disappointed that you were met with meh. So just as you head into fall, could you just sort of talk through that and quickly?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge, so in that letter, I was kind of like whining a little bit about that, which I had a lot of fun with that demonstration, but that was me having fun. And so the flaw there is that's not really engagement, right? Watching, even if you watch your professor burn his eyebrows off, you're not engaging with learning and with those objects. And so the challenge for me going forward is how to ensure that the stuff that I'm all about the experience. So I want the students to have a powerful experience, but how can I create an experience that I'm excited about, but also make sure that I pull them back in. And it's a real challenge with an online laboratory experience. I can just say, sort of as a teaser, that we're trying to think creatively about how to keep students, mentally and personally engaged with doing experiments, even while they're at a remove through Zoom or whatever the mechanism winds up being. But that was a lesson that I've sort of subsequently been reflecting on, is that there's tools at my disposal for presenting an online experience, but it actually still has to be an experience, right? And viewing is an experience, but it's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the students to have their own sort of visceral, intimate engagement with the ideas, and that's our challenge.
Well, I look forward to seeing how you end up proceeding with this and hearing about that. I also really appreciate the productive and really student-centered ways that you are approaching and asking others to approach and think about not just assessment, but teaching more broadly. And so with that, I will say, Dr. Gillespie, thank you so much for your time and for talking with me about your experience. And thank you also to everyone joining us on Facebook.
Thanks, Bye. Lorna. It was great talking with you. Bye.
Yes, you too.